The priest had just asked if anyone objected, when Mara Doyle's future mother-in-law rose from the front pew and announced, loud enough for 200 guests to hear, that no cross would marry a woman built like Mara. The church didn't gasp, it laughed. Mara stood frozen at the altar, in ivory silk, that had taken 3 fittings to get right over a body no one in that room considered acceptable. And she watched the man she was seconds from marrying stare at his own shoes instead of defending her. Nathaniel Cross said nothing, while his mother told a church full of witnesses that this wedding was an embarrassment, that someone should escort the bride out before she humiliated the family any further. Someone did. 2 ushers she didn't recognize took her by the elbows, like she was an obstacle, not a bride. Mara didn't cry, and that detail would unsettle people later when they retold the story over drinks. She let them march her past the pews, past relatives already lifting their phones to record it, past Celeste Marchetti in the second row, with a hand pressed to her mouth, in a shock too rehearsed to be real. Mara noticed that. Her father had taught her to notice things that didn't add up, and Celeste's performance didn't. She'd made it almost to the doors, when a voice stopped the entire aisle cold. Nobody walks anywhere until I've said my piece. He hadn't been on any guest list. He came up the center aisle in a black suit that made every rented tuxedo in the building look like a costume, and the room seemed to lose 10 degrees with every step he took. Mara didn't know his name yet. She only knew that the ushers holding her arms let go like they'd touched something hot, and that Nathaniel had gone the color of the altar cloth. Damiano, Nathaniel said, and his voice cracked on it. Damiano Rocca didn't look at the groom. He looked at Mara instead, at the mascara she refused to wipe away, at the spine she was still forcing straight, and something behind his eyes recalculated. Your family owes me $11 million, Cross, he said, eyes still on her, and you picked today to make me disappear. He finally turned to the congregation, to the mother of the groom still on her feet. This wedding's finished, Damiano said. The debt isn't, and neither, apparently, is she. He extended a hand toward Mara. Not a request, something already decided. She didn't take it right away. The last time she'd trusted a man's hand in front of a crowd, she'd ended up dragged toward the exit for it. So she studied him instead, the sharp angles of his face, the stillness sitting on him like something colder than the air conditioning. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. But you know Nathaniel Cross just tried to marry into money he doesn't have to pay off a debt he owes me, and used you as the cover story. That makes you my business, whether either of us wants it to be. Nathaniel found his voice near the altar. Damiano, we can discuss the loan. There's no reason to bring her into. There's every reason. Damiano still hadn't looked at him. You knew the balloon payment was due next month. You were marrying into the Whitfield Trust to cover it. That's not a wedding, Cross. That's a con, and you ran it in a church. The congregation made a sound somewhere between a gasp and delight, the kind that guaranteed this would be dinner party gossip by nightfall. Mara felt heat climb her face. Not shame now, but something with an edge to it. Every fitting, every seating chart she'd memorized, none of it had ever been about her. You knew, she said to Nathaniel. You knew. And you let your mother stand up and call me a mistake, instead of telling me the truth yourself. His silence was the only answer she needed. Damiano's hand was still out. Mara looked at it, then back at the doors the ushers had nearly thrown her through, and made a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. She took it. His grip was steadier than anything else in the church, and he didn't pull her forward so much as fall into step beside her as they walked out together, past Celeste's careful shock, past the mother of the groom gone pale as her son's excuses, into a September afternoon that smelled like rain that hadn't started yet. A black car idled at the curb. I'm not getting into a car with a stranger, Mara said, even as some exhausted, furious part of her wanted to disappear into it. and never look at that church again. Good instinct, Damiano said. He opened the door anyway. Damiano Rocca. I run the north side of this city. Whether the papers print my name for it or not. Cross owes me money, and just tried to hand me his fiancée like an apology basket. I don't accept gifts I didn't choose. Then what am I to you? Tonight. Someone who needs a ride away from people who just humiliated her in front of half of Chicago. Tomorrow, we can talk about the rest. She should have refused. She would tell herself that for weeks, but her feet moved before her mind finished arguing, and she got in. Mara didn't ask where they were going, and Damiano didn't offer it. The car merged onto Lakeshore Drive, and the silence stretched until the skyline blurred gray under a sky that still hadn't decided whether to rain. You said my father's name, she finally said. Back at the church. You didn't say it by accident. Damiano's eyes stayed on the window. Robert Doyle, forensic accountant. Died 18 months ago in what the coroner called a heart attack. It was a heart attack, maybe. He turned to look at her now, and there was nothing gentle in it, only calculation. 2 weeks ago, a payment cleared into an account linked to the Whitfield Trust, the same trust Cross was marrying into. It came from 3 shell companies deep, but the original wire traced back to a firm your father used to audit. That's not a coincidence I believe in. Mara's chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the dress still cutting into her ribs. My father spent the last year of his life obsessed with some case he wouldn't talk about. He said it was going to be the biggest thing he ever uncovered. Then he had a heart attack in his office, at 11 at night, alone, and everyone told me it was stress. Was he a man who scared easily? No. The word came out before she could soften it. He was the most stubborn man I ever knew. Then it's worth asking why a man like that would suddenly stop being stubborn. Damiano's jaw tightened. Because 2 of the men whose money he was tracing are men my organization does business with, whether I like it or not. And a 3rd is Nathaniel Cross's father. The car pulled up in front of a townhouse in a neighborhood Mara didn't recognize. Brick and ivy and a black door with no number on it. Damiano didn't wait for her to agree to go inside. He simply held the door open, the way he'd held it at the church. An offer that wasn't quite a demand, but wasn't far from one either. Inside, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up into it, looked up from a laptop at the kitchen table, and did a double take at Mara's wedding dress. This is Rosa, Damiano said. She runs my household and knows more about what happens in this city than anyone else alive. Rosa. Ms. Doyle needs a place to think for a few days. Rosa's eyes flicked from the dress to Mara's face, reading something there that made her expression soften. There's a guest room upstairs, and clothes that'll actually fit, not whatever they were trying to squeeze you into for that show today. It was such a small kindness that Mara had to look away before her eyes betrayed her. I don't need charity, she said, more to Damiano than to Rosa. This isn't charity. Damiano set his keys on the counter like a man settling in for a conversation he intended to finish. You have information I need, whether you know you have it or not. Your father kept records, ledgers, files, something. If he was building a case that made 3 families nervous enough to want him dead, he didn't keep it all in his office. Men like that always have a second copy. He didn't tell me anything about his work. He didn't want me involved. Did he leave you anything? Storage unit, safety deposit box, a box in an attic you never opened? Mara opened her mouth to say no, and then stopped, because there was a storage unit on the south side that she'd been paying for out of guilt for 18 months, without ever going through the boxes inside, because opening them meant admitting her father was really gone. Something must have shown on her face, because Damiano's eyes sharpened with the particular focus of a man who'd just found what he came for. There's something, he said. It wasn't a question. There might be, Mara admitted, and hated how much she suddenly wanted to trust the stranger who'd walked her out of her own wedding. "But I'm not opening anything for you until you tell me why my father is dead, and what any of this has to do with you." For the first time since the church, something that wasn't quite a smile moved across Damiano's mouth. "Fair enough. Sit down, Ms. Doyle. This is going to take a while, and you're still wearing a wedding dress for a wedding that isn't happening." Mara sat, and for the first time since the doors of the church had closed behind her, she let herself feel the full weight of how completely her life had just changed. Before he left the kitchen that night, Damiano paused at the doorway and looked back at Rosa. "Move her things to the east wing tomorrow. Nobody gets near her without going through me first. And put Marco on the storage unit tonight. He's the only one I trust not to ask questions he doesn't need answered." The storage unit smelled like dust and cardboard when Mara finally unlocked it 3 days later. Damiano, standing a careful distance behind her, like he understood this moment belonged to her and not to him. She'd expected old furniture. Instead, she found 11 bankers' boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one labeled in her father's cramped, meticulous handwriting. Whitfield Holdings, Cross Industries Shell Entities, Rocca, Do Not File. Her stomach dropped seeing his name written like a warning. "He was watching you specifically," she said, pulling the box down. "Or watching, who was using my name to move money without my knowledge." Damiano's voice had gone quiet, in a way she was starting to recognize as focus rather than calm. "Open it." Inside were spreadsheets, wire transfer records, and a ledger in her father's handwriting that made Mara's chest ache just looking at it. She hadn't seen his writing in 18 months. She'd forgotten the way his sevens crossed themselves, the way he underlined totals twice when something didn't add up. He cross-referenced these against public shipping manifests, she said slowly, tracing a column with her finger, before she'd even fully processed what she was reading. "Look, here. He's matching wire dates to container shipments through the port. Whoever's laundering this money is running it through freight, not just banks." Damiano went very still beside her. "Say that again. The shell companies aren't just moving cash. They're using shipping invoices to justify the transfers, over-invoicing freight costs, to make dirty money look like legitimate trade payments. My father used to explain this stuff to me when I was in college, back when I still thought accounting was boring." Her throat tightened. "I guess I paid more attention than I realized. Most forensic auditors in this city couldn't have spotted that pattern in a week of work," Damiano said, and there was something almost startled in the way he studied her now, like he was recalculating an equation he'd already thought he'd solved. "You did it in 10 minutes. I'm not an auditor. I'm a pastry chef." The words came out sharper than she meant them. 3 days of humiliation and grief finding an outlet. "I make wedding cakes for women whose mothers-in-law would rather see me thrown out of a church than sitting at the head table. I'm not some asset you can use." "I didn't say you were an asset." Something shifted in his voice, quieter now. "I said you're sharper than most men on my payroll, and you didn't even know it until an hour ago." The compliment sat strangely between them, and Mara found herself looking up at him properly, for the first time since the church, past the danger everyone in this city apparently associated with his name, to the man underneath who was watching her, like she'd surprised him. "Why do you care so much about who's laundering money through your name?" she asked. $11 million is a debt. This is something else." Damiano's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. 6 years ago, my younger brother was killed in a deal that went wrong on the docks," he said finally. "Everyone told me it was a rival family. I believed them, because believing anything else meant admitting someone closer to me let it happen." He nodded toward the ledger in her hands. "Your father's shipping dates. Cross-reference them against March, 6 years back." Mara flipped through pages with hands that had started to shake, found the month, and felt something cold settle into her stomach when she saw the entry circled twice in her father's red pen. "There's a payment here," she said quietly, "from an account linked to Cross Industries, dated 4 days before whatever happened to your brother." The silence that followed had a different weight to it than any silence before it. "Say the name on the account," Damiano said. Mara looked up at him and understood, in that moment, that she was holding evidence that could unmake the very family who'd just humiliated her at the altar, and that the man standing across from her had just realized his brother's death had nothing to do with strangers and everything to do with people who'd sat in the front pews of that church 3 days ago. "Celeste Marchetti," she read aloud. "It's routed through an account with Celeste Marchetti's name on it." Damiano didn't move for a long moment. Mara had seen men go quiet with anger before. Her father's clients sometimes did it in the waiting room before a difficult audit. But this was different. A stillness so total, it felt like standing near something that had just decided not to explode. "Celeste Marchetti," he repeated, like testing whether the name would hurt less the second time. "She's been at every family dinner Cross has thrown for the last 2 years. My mother likes her. Maybe your mother doesn't know what she is. Maybe nobody does." He took the ledger from Mara's hands carefully, like it might shatter, and studied the circled entry himself. "I need to know how deep this goes before I move on anyone. If Celeste was funneling money through Cross Industries 6 years ago, she wasn't acting alone. Someone above her authorized it." "That's not my problem to solve," Mara said, though even as she said it, she didn't quite believe herself. "I came here to find out why my father died, not to become your forensic accountant. You're already both." Damiano's eyes found hers, steady in a way that unsettled her more than his anger had. "Your father built this case because someone was going to use it to hurt people. You're the only person alive who can read it the way he intended it to be read. I can protect you while you do that. I can't do it without you." Rosa appeared in the doorway of the storage unit then, phone in hand, her expression tighter than Mara had seen it in the 3 days she'd known her. "Damiano," Rosa said. "Cross just called the house line. He wants a meeting. Says it's about the debt. Tell him I'll consider it. He also asked if the girl was with you." Rosa's eyes flicked to Mara. "He used your name specifically." Something in Mara's spine went cold. 3 days ago, Nathaniel had stood at that altar and let his mother call her a mistake in front of 200 people. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't shown a flicker of concern for the woman he was supposed to marry. Now, the moment her name surfaced next to Damiano Roca's, he wanted a meeting. "He's not worried about me," Mara said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. "He's worried about what I might have found in my father's files." "That tracks," Damiano said, "which means Cross knows exactly what your father was investigating, and he's known it for a while." Or, Celeste told him. Mara's mind was already running ahead, the way it used to, when her father would lay out a case at the dinner table and ask her to find the hole in it before he brought it to the DA. If she's the one moving money through his company, she'd need him to look the other way. That means either he's in on it, or she's using him without his knowledge. Damiano studied her again, with that same recalculating look, the one that made her feel less like a curiosity and more like a colleague, and it did something to her chest she didn't have time to examine. "You think fast," he said. "Faster than anyone I've had working this case. I think fast when it's my father's life on the line." Mara closed the box lid, suddenly exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "What happens now? Now you stay somewhere Cross can't reach you, and I find out how far up this goes before anyone else disappears." Damiano's voice hardened on the last word, and Mara understood he wasn't only talking about her father anymore. "Rosa, move her things to the East Wing. Nobody gets near her without going through me first." "I don't need a bodyguard," Mara said, some old stubborn pride flaring even through the fear. "You need one, whether you want one or not." Damiano's eyes didn't leave hers. Your father died because he knew too much. You know the same things now. I'm not going to let you become the second Doyle this city buries over a ledger." The words landed harder than she expected, and for the first time since the wedding, Mara felt something other than humiliation settle over her, something closer to being seen. That feeling followed her into the dinner Rosa arranged 3 nights later, an easy excuse to pull Mara away from the files for one evening. Marco Bellini, the Lieutenant Damiano, had put on the storage unit that first night, pulled out the chair beside her, and spent the better part of an hour asking about her father's old cases with genuine curiosity. She hadn't expected Damiano to go quiet the way he did. It wasn't obvious at first, just a stillness settling over him 2 seats down, his wineglass untouched, his attention fixed on Marco's hand resting briefly on the back of Mara's chair. By dessert, Damiano had said perhaps 6 words in 20 minutes, and Rosa kept glancing between him and Mara like she was watching a storm gather. "You're quiet tonight," Mara said once the guests had drifted into the sitting room, clearing glasses, an excuse to get him alone. "I'm always quiet, not like this." You looked at Marco like you wanted to throw him through a window. Something flickered across his face. "Caught. I don't have a claim on you," he said, low, like the words cost him something. "You're not mine to be jealous over. It doesn't change the fact that watching another man's hand near your chair for an hour made me want to do something I'd regret." Mara's breath caught. "Why does it bother you so much?" "I know it shouldn't," Damiano said. "That's exactly the problem." He said nothing else that night. Mara went to bed, turning his words over, understanding for the first time that whatever was growing between them had already outgrown the careful boundaries either of them had tried to keep around it. The trap came dressed as an invitation. 2 weeks into staying at the Rocca estate, Mara had almost let herself believe in the strange rhythm they'd built. Mornings spent cross-referencing her father's ledgers over coffee. Afternoons where Damiano would find reasons to be in whatever room she occupied. Evenings where Rosa taught her which of his silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he was worried. She hadn't expected to feel steadier here, in a house that belonged to a man half the city feared, than she ever had in Nathaniel Cross's world. Then Celeste Marchetti sent a handwritten note asking Mara to meet her for coffee. One woman to another, no men involved, an old habit from before everything fell apart, and Mara made the mistake of going alone. She told herself it was reconnaissance. She told herself she could learn something useful without Damiano hovering over every word. What she hadn't accounted for was the photographer waiting across the street, or the fact that Celeste had chosen a cafe 2 blocks from a Cross Industries office, or that the entire meeting had been staged for an audience Mara couldn't see. By that evening, photos were circulating through half of Damiano's organization, grainy shots of Mara sitting close to Celeste, heads bent together like old friends conspiring, time-stamped an hour before a shipment belonging to a rival family went missing from the port. Damiano found her in the East Wing, with the photos already spread across his desk when she walked in. "Explain this," he said, and his voice had gone to the register she'd heard him use on Nathaniel Cross in the church, cold enough to make the room feel smaller. "Celeste asked to meet. I thought I could get information out of her." Mara's stomach dropped seeing the photos, understanding instantly how damning they looked stripped of context. It wasn't what it looks like. A shipment disappeared an hour after this photo was taken. Cargo that would have paid off 3 men I answer to. Damiano's jaw was tight, his eyes doing that terrible calculating thing. Only now it was aimed at her, instead of a ledger. "You've been in this house 2 weeks. You have access to my schedule, my security rotations, information about that dock through your father's files. And the one time you leave without telling anyone, cargo goes missing within the hour. You think I did this. I think I don't know what to think, and that terrifies me more than the missing shipment does." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the only sign of how much this was costing him. Tell me why I shouldn't believe the evidence in front of me." Mara looked at him, at the 2 weeks of careful trust unraveling in real time, and something inside her went very still and very proud. She would not beg. She would not explain herself to a man who'd chosen suspicion over the version of her he'd claimed to see so clearly in that storage unit. "I won't defend myself against a photograph," she said quietly. "You either believe what you've seen of me these past 2 weeks, or you believe I'm capable of betraying you over coffee with a woman who tried to destroy my wedding. I can't make that decision for you. Mara, I'll pack my things." Her voice didn't shake, though everything underneath it wanted to. "Have Rosa call me a cab. I won't make this harder than it already is." Damiano didn't stop her. She would remember that later, turning it over like a wound that wouldn't close. The fact that he let her walk out of that office, and up the stairs, and out the front door with a single suitcase. That for all his talk of protection, he'd chosen the version of events that painted her as a traitor the second it became convenient. She was 3 blocks from the estate, suitcase wheels catching on uneven pavement, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your father's ledger, page 47. The dock shipment schedule was altered 2 days before you ever met Celeste for coffee. Someone set this up before you walked into that cafe." Mara stopped walking. Her hands shook as she scrolled back through photos of the ledger pages she'd taken for her own records, found page 47, and felt her blood go cold seeing the date stamped in her father's handwriting, a full week before Celeste's note had ever arrived. Someone had planned this before she'd made a single mistake. Mara read the text 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to type back. "Who is this?" This time, an answer came. "Marco Bellini. I've had eyes on the storage facility since the day Damiano asked me to watch it, before you ever moved into the estate. I saw the schedule change in the port database 2 days ago, because I still have login access to the system's cross-industry shares with the docks. A courtesy from before Damiano's people found out what his family was really doing. I didn't tell him yet. Wanted to be sure, before I said anything, that could get you both hurt over nothing." Mara's chest tightened, remembering the dinner, remembering the careful hour Marco had spent asking about her father's cases, remembering the tension it had put on Damiano's face, without either of them naming it out loud. She hadn't taken Marco for someone who'd go this far to protect information quietly, but it made a rough kind of sense. A loyal lieutenant, with access nobody had thought to close off, watching for exactly the kind of manipulation his boss was too personally involved to see clearly. "Why help me?" she typed. "Because I've watched Damiano make 1 mistake with you already, and he doesn't get to make a second one while I sit on proof that could stop it. Get somewhere safe. I'm telling him what I found in 10 minutes, whether you're ready or not." Mara pocketed the phone, page 47 already glowing with new meaning, and understood that the 10 minutes Marco had just given her were the only head start she was going to get. She went back, not to the estate, to the storage unit, where copies of every page still sat in boxes nobody had thought to lock down, because if someone had altered a shipping schedule before she'd ever agreed to coffee with Celeste, the proof of that manipulation would still be sitting in her father's original files, untouched by whoever was trying to frame her now. It took 4 hours cross-referencing timestamps against her father's meticulous underlining, but she found it. The dock schedule Celeste had supposedly disrupted had been altered in a database entry dated 9 days earlier, logged under a user credential that didn't belong to Celeste Marchetti at all. It belonged to Nathaniel Cross. Mara sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit at nearly midnight, staring at a printout that proved her almost husband had planted evidence to make it look like she'd betrayed the one person in the city who'd actually protected her, and she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how far he'd go to bury what her father had uncovered. Her phone rang. Rosa's name on the screen. "Where are you?" Rosa's voice was tight, none of its usual warmth in it. "Damiano's been tearing this city apart for 6 hours, looking for you. I thought he believed I'd betrayed him. He believed a photograph for exactly 40 minutes before Marco brought him what he found," Rosa said. "Damiano's been pulling apart every second of that meeting since. Mara, he thinks Cross set you up to get you out of the house so his men could get to you. He thinks you might already be in danger, and he doesn't know where you are." The line went dead in Mara's ear, a half-second before the storage unit door slid open behind her, and 2 men she didn't recognize stepped through it, one of them holding a phone up, like he was documenting something for someone waiting to see it. "Ms. Doyle," the taller one said, almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "Mr. Cross would like a word. He's very insistent." Mara's mind ran through every option in the half-second she had to think. The ledger pages spread around her, the door blocked, her phone already slipping toward a dead battery warning. She grabbed the printed page proving Cross's login credential, folded it small, and shoved it into her boot before either man crossed the distance between them. "Tell Nathaniel," she said, standing slowly, forcing steel into a voice that wanted to shake, "that I already know what he did, and that whatever he thinks he's protecting by grabbing me off a storage unit floor is about to fall apart a lot faster than he's planned for." The shorter man laughed, unimpressed, and reached for her arm. 3 blocks away, in a car moving faster than Chicago traffic laws generally allowed, Damiano Rocca received a single text from a storage facility security guard he'd paid to watch that unit the moment Mara's father's name had first come up, a man loyal to him long before Cross Industries ever existed. 2 men just took a woman from Unit 14C, black sedan, heading south on Halsted. Damiano didn't answer. He simply turned the car south, jaw locked, hands white on the wheel, and understood with a clarity that terrified him more than any debt or any dead brother ever had, that if something happened to Mara Doyle in the next 20 minutes, he would burn Nathaniel Cross's entire world to the ground and feel nothing but relief doing it. The men shoved Mara into the back of the sedan hard enough to bruise, and she used the 2 seconds it took them to circle around to the driver's side to slide the folded printout deeper into her boot and press her palm flat against the door panel, memorizing the make, the smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne, anything her father would have told her to notice if she ever found herself exactly here. "Nathaniel's going to want to talk business," the taller man said from the passenger seat, not unkindly, like this was simply a transaction he found mildly distasteful. "You give him what he wants. This ends easy. What does he want?" "The ledger, all of it. And your word, you never saw what's in it." Mara almost laughed. Even now, even after the church, after Celeste, after 9 days of a manufactured betrayal, Nathaniel still believed a piece of paper and a promise could undo 6 years of buried evidence. They drove her to a warehouse near the rail yards, the kind of building that existed in every city for exactly this purpose, and Nathaniel was already waiting inside when they walked her in, looking less like the golden boy who'd stood frozen at the altar, and more like a man who'd finally run out of rooms to hide in. "You didn't have to make this complicated," he said, and had the audacity to sound wounded by her silence. "If you'd just handed over what your father left you, none of this would have happened." "None of what, Nathaniel? The wedding humiliation, or the part where you had me kidnapped from a storage unit?" Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt, some cold clarity settling over her, the way it used to when her father laid out numbers that didn't add up and asked her to find the lie in them. "Which crime are we talking about tonight? Don't be dramatic. Your login altered a shipping schedule 9 days before Celeste ever asked me to coffee." Mara watched something flicker across his face, confirmation dressed up as surprise. "You set me up. You made it look like I'd betrayed the one person who actually protected me, so Damiano would throw me out before I finished reading what my father left behind." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. My father's business has survived 3 generations without your father's meddling. Robert Doyle should have stayed in his lane. He was a forensic accountant. Numbers were his lane. Something cold and furious was rising in Mara now, burning away whatever fear had gotten her this far. Did you kill him, or did you just look the other way, while someone else did? The silence that followed answered louder than any confession. It doesn't matter now, Nathaniel finally said. What matters is you're going to tell me where the rest of those files are, and you're going to do it before Damiano figures out where his men lost your trail. He won't lose it. Mara said it with a certainty she felt down to her bones, though she had no proof of it, beyond 2 weeks of watching a man rearrange his entire schedule to make sure she was never alone in a house full of armed strangers. He's already coming. As if summoned by the words themselves, the warehouse door at the far end blew inward with a force that rattled the corrugated metal walls, and Damiano Rocca walked through it, flanked by 4 men, expression carved from something that made even Nathaniel's guards step back instinctively. "Nathaniel," Damiano said, voice low and terribly calm, the calm of a man who had already decided how this ended, and was simply walking through the formalities. "You had 2 weeks to come to me like a man, and admit what your family's been hiding. Instead, you kidnapped a woman under my protection. She has something that belongs to my family's future," Nathaniel said, though his voice had lost its conviction. "She has proof your family murdered a man for doing his job, and that you personally framed her to cover it." Damiano's eyes finally found Mara's across the warehouse floor, and something in them loosened. Relief and fury tangled together in a way she'd never seen on him before. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice cracked slightly on the word, the adrenaline finally catching up to her. "But I have proof, Damiano. His login. It's in my boot." Nathaniel's men shifted, and for one suspended second, the warehouse held its breath, every person in the room understanding that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds would decide considerably more than one kidnapping. Nathaniel's guards made the mistake of reaching for their weapons first. It ended faster than Mara expected, less a battle than a correction. Damiano's men moving with the kind of coordinated economy that came from having done this before, disarming and restraining rather than escalating, because Damiano had made it clear before they ever left the estate that he wanted Nathaniel Cross alive and talking, not dead and useless. Mara stayed pressed against the cold metal wall through all of it, watching the man who 2 weeks ago had believed a photograph over her word, now moving through gunfire and chaos, like she was the only thing in the room worth protecting. When it was over, Nathaniel stood alone in the center of the warehouse floor, guards zip-tied against a support beam, the golden boy composure that had carried him through a lifetime of inherited privilege, finally cracking all the way through. "You don't understand what you're unraveling," he said, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely afraid, rather than merely inconvenienced. "This isn't just my father's business. Celeste's family runs half the Port Authority. If you pull this thread, 3 organizations go down with it, mine included. Then you should have thought about that before you had a man killed for finding it," Damiano said. "I didn't kill anyone," Nathaniel's voice cracked. "That was Celeste. She came to me 8 months ago and said Robert Doyle was getting close to exposing the shipping fraud. Said she'd handle it quietly. I thought she meant paying him off. I didn't know what she'd actually done until it was already finished, and by then, I was as guilty as she was, just for staying silent." Mara felt something in her chest crack open at that. 18 months of grief, finally finding a name to attach itself to. Not an accident, not stress. A decision made by a woman who'd sat 2 rows back at her wedding, wearing borrowed grief for a crime she'd actually committed. "Where is she now?" Damiano asked, voice gone dangerously quiet. "I don't know. She stopped answering my calls 3 days ago, right after your men started asking questions at the port. Convenient timing. She's not stupid, Damiano. If she thinks this is unraveling, She's already positioning herself to disappear, or worse. Nathaniel's eyes found Mara's, something almost like an apology in them. Too little and 18 months too late to matter. She still thinks you don't know it was her. If you move on her now, quietly, before she knows you've made the connection, you might actually catch her. Damiano's men had already pulled Mara's printed evidence from her boot, verifying the login credentials against records they'd need for whatever came next, legal or otherwise. And Damiano crossed the warehouse floor to stand in front of her, while his men dealt with Nathaniel, close enough that she could see exactly how much the last 6 hours had cost him. "I should never have doubted you," he said, low enough that it was only for her. "A photograph. I let a photograph undo 2 weeks of watching you work through your father's files, with more integrity than anyone I've ever had on payroll. You believed evidence over instinct," Mara said, and found she didn't have the energy left to be angry about it, only tired in a way that went bone deep. "That's not nothing, Damiano. But it's also not enough. Not if this is what happens every time someone hands you a photograph. It won't happen again." His hand came up, hesitant in a way nothing about him had been all night, and rested against her jaw, careful, like he was afraid she might still disappear. "I nearly lost you tonight because I chose suspicion over what I already knew about you. That's a mistake I only intend to make once." Behind them, one of Damiano's men approached with a phone held out, expression grim. "Boss, Celeste Marchetti just booked a flight out of O'Hare. Private charter. Wheels up in 90 minutes. 90 minutes wasn't enough time to do this carefully, so Damiano didn't try. But Mara had spent the drive to O'Hare doing what her father had trained her to do without ever meaning to, working the angles. She'd found the name Patricia Alvarez circled twice in her father's ledger, a district attorney's contact he'd trusted enough to write in his own private code, and she'd used Rosa's phone to call the number before anyone in the convoy realized what she was doing, because if this ended tonight, she wanted it to end somewhere no one could make it disappear. Celeste froze mid-stride across the tarmac, seeing who waited beside her charter plane. "This is a public space, Damiano. Whatever you think you know. I know you authorized a payment through Cross Industries 4 days before my brother died," Damiano said. "I know what you did to Robert Doyle." Celeste's composure held a moment longer than Mara expected, right up until Mara stepped forward herself, ledger in hand. "I called the district attorney's office 20 minutes ago," Mara said, voice steady, despite her pulse hammering. "Not Damiano's people. The actual DA, using my father's original contact, a woman named Patricia Alvarez who worked with him for a decade and never stopped believing his death wasn't natural. She's 15 minutes out with federal agents, because unlike Damiano's organization, they can actually make an arrest that survives a defense attorney." She held up the ledger. "You don't get to disappear onto a private jet, Celeste. You get to answer for this in a courtroom, in public, the way you tried to make sure I never would." Celeste's mask finally cracked. Whatever escape she'd planned, just cut off by a woman she'd underestimated twice. A car screeched onto the tarmac before she could run, and out of it stepped not federal agents first, but Eleanor Cross, Nathaniel's mother, ashen-faced, having heard everything from her son's frantic call an hour earlier. "Celeste," Eleanor said, voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere left to hide behind. "Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't kill a man in my son's name." Celeste said nothing, and the silence was answer enough. Eleanor turned to Mara then, the same woman who'd stood in a church and called her a mistake in front of 200 guests, and for the first time, her composure failed her entirely. "I said terrible things to you. I believed my son was marrying beneath him, when the truth is, he was marrying a woman worth 10 of anyone at that wedding, including me." Mara didn't offer forgiveness easily, not after everything, but she didn't need to say anything at all, because federal agents were already crossing the tarmac, and Celeste Marchetti's 6 years of buried crimes were finally catching up to her in real time. in public, exactly as Mara had promised. Nathaniel Cross's cooperation bought him a reduced sentence, but it didn't buy him what he wanted most: his family's name. Cross Industries was dissolved within 4 months, its assets seized to repay a debt list that stretched far beyond Damiano Rocca's $11 million. Eleanor Cross sold the family estate to cover what remained, and moved into a modest apartment on the city's north side, a stunning fall from the front pew of a church she'd once ruled from. She wrote Mara a letter of apology that Mara read once and filed away, not out of cruelty, but because some doors close for good reasons. Celeste Marchetti's trial became the kind Chicago talked about for years. 6 counts including the murder of Robert Doyle, laundering charges spanning 3 organizations, and a jury that took less than 4 hours to convict her on every count. She would spend the rest of her natural life in a federal prison, and the tarmac confession Damiano's men had recorded played a role in sealing that outcome long before it ever reached a courtroom. 6 months after the tarmac, Chicago's society pages ran a story nobody expected, and everybody who mattered read twice. Mara didn't think about any of them much anymore. She'd opened her own bakery in a storefront 2 blocks from the Rocca estate, funded not by Damiano's money, but by her father's life insurance, the policy she'd never touched, because using it had felt too much like admitting he was really gone. Now it felt like the opposite. It felt like finishing something he'd started. She was icing the last of a wedding cake, an actual one this time, commissioned by a young couple who'd walked in off the street with nothing but nerves and enough love to fill the shop with it. When Damiano appeared in the doorway, the way he always did lately, unannounced but never unwelcome, dark suit, slightly less severe than the ones he used to wear like armor. "You're going to ruin my reputation showing up here in the middle of the day," Mara said without looking up, though the smile pulling at her mouth gave her away completely. "My reputation survived a Mafia war and a federal indictment against 3 families. I think it can survive being seen at a bakery." He crossed the room, careful of the flour dusting the counters, and set something small on the marble beside her piping bag. "I have something for you. It isn't a ledger this time." Mara set down the icing bag and picked up the box. Small and simple, nothing like the ostentatious ring Nathaniel had once presented at a restaurant full of cameras he'd arranged himself. Inside sat a single stone, understated, exactly the kind of thing a woman who spent her days elbow-deep in buttercream could actually wear to work. Damiano. "I've spent 6 years believing that loving someone made you weak enough to lose them," he said, and his voice had none of the coldness that used to sit over every word like armor, only the same steadiness he'd shown her in a warehouse with guns drawn, in a storage unit at midnight, in every quiet moment since when he'd chosen her over suspicion, over old wounds, over the version of himself that believed control was the only thing keeping him safe. "You taught me the opposite is true. I've never been stronger than I am standing in a bakery covered in flour, asking a woman who once got thrown out of her own wedding to marry me properly this time." Mara thought about the church, about the ushers pulling her toward the doors, about her mother-in-law's voice calling her a mistake in front of 200 people who'd laughed along with her. She thought about her father's ledger, about the storage unit floor, about a warehouse where she'd refused to fold, even with a gun pointed at her chest. She thought about how far she'd come from the woman who'd let a wedding define her worth, and understood that everything Nathaniel had taken from her that day, Damiano had given back tenfold, not because he'd rescued her, but because he'd seen her clearly enough to know she never needed rescuing at all. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steady, sure, nothing like the girl who'd stood frozen at that altar 6 months ago. "But this time, nobody walks me down the aisle who thinks I'm something to be ashamed of. This time," Damiano said, pulling her close enough that the flour on her apron transferred to his suit, and neither of them cared. "Everyone in that church is going to know exactly whose hand you're choosing to hold, and exactly how much stronger it makes both of us. Outside the bakery window, Chicago moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the small miracles happening inside ordinary storefronts. And Mara Doyle, once thrown out of her own wedding for being too much of everything the world had told her she shouldn't be, stood in the arms of a man who'd learned that love didn't make him weaker. It made him, finally, exactly strong enough.